We are happy to have with us today Dawn Allen. She is yet another member of Lost Voices of Fentanyl, and she's going to be sharing her story today about the loss of her precious son, Ben.
Good morning.
Morning. Okay, well, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about Ben? Tell us about his early life and then how things progressed and the ultimate tragedy that happened.
Well, thank you so much for an opportunity to share with you today. And I just wanted to let you know that I do have affiliations with the Lost Voices for Fentanyl, but I do actually serve on the board for the Drug Induced Homicide Foundation, which is another foundation that has partnered with Lost Voices and doing work a little bit more specific to the criminal investigations following the loss of somebody to a drug poisoning death. But April from Lost Voices was the one who referred me to you, and
Mhm.
so both of them are great programs, and I'm really pleased to be able to partner with them.
That's
Um,
great. That's great.
yeah. So my son Benjamin, we lost him in March 16th of last year, and he was 22 years old. Back in 2017, he was in a car accident, and he and some friends were doing a little bit of speeding around a neighborhood, and sadly hit a tree. And my son was ejected from the vehicle, suffered some very, very serious, life-threatening injuries that absolutely he should not have walked away from that accident. But it did result in a number of major operations, almost a year of inpatient um, rehabilitation. He did some of that here in Illinois eh, immediately following surgery, but then he went out to Dallas, Texas to the Center for Neuroskills, which is a post-acute rehab that works with young people who suffered a brain injury and needed to be able to learn new skills, create new skill sets to kind of navigate life now with some of the deficits that were created by this really traumatic brain injury that Benjamin sustained. And so over the course of 7 surgeries and a great deal of, again, rehabilitation, he was on some form of a controlled substance for over a year. They were treating him with pain medication. He had peripheral neuropathy. He fractured his spine. He suffered numerous myofascial injuries, reconstructive surgeries. His whole cranium needed to be reconstructed. So he was experiencing a great deal of pain. And with that came the introduction of opioid pain medications. And it has been the case in so many of the other families that I've spoken with. Some kind of trauma happened. They were introduced to medication. The physician stopped prescribing it, but the pain itself hadn't really dissipated. And by that point, a dependency had been developed. And so within the first year of his accident, we saw him fight and fight and fight to get to the stage of being able to reclaim his life back in some semblance of normalcy, followed by another tragedy when we discovered that Benjamin was very much within the grasp of addiction. And that year following his completion of recovery was probably more traumatic than even what we endured during the aftermath of his accident. He just suffered so much. And he was a young man whose father was never present in his life. So he was carrying some brokenheartedness that I think lent itself to make him a little more vulnerable to substance abuse. And so he was in some kind of a recovery program for a long time, and then would come out, would relapse. But the year or two before his death, Benjamin made the decision independently, without anybody pushing him to do so, to go into recovery. And he did a 90-day program instead of a 60-day program. And then he did what they considered to be like follow-up recovery work. And then following that, he decided to go into sober living, which is another layer of recovery. And he did that for a lot longer than most young people will choose to do so if the courts aren't forcing them to. And he was very vested in his recovery. But he was also doing all this about an hour and a half away from our home. So when he decided that he wanted to discharge from sober living, he was essentially coming back to an area where he didn't have the same safeguards. He didn't have the same community that had been helping him maintain sobriety. And so within a matter of 5 days, he was also without physicians that were prescribing some medications that were helping him satiate cravings. and he had a follow-up appointment set up with a new doctor back here in Waukegan, Illinois, which is where we live. And very quickly after getting out of recovery, he decided to reach out to a friend for a Xanax, which was a medication that he had taken in the past to control anxiety, as well as a couple other things that he was dealing with in the wake of his accident. And so once he got that medication from his friend, he came home, laid down, we said goodnight, we hugged, and we had a really lovely exchange. He and I had plans to go to an NA meeting in the morning. I went to go wake him up, and we discovered that he had passed away overnight. And it wasn't until a couple weeks later that we were made aware that the Xanax pill that Benjamin had got from his friend actually was a counterfeit pill, and that it had contained multiple lethal doses of illicit fentanyl.
Wow.
And sadly, that's something that is a trend that we're seeing a great deal of. These young people, they get pills, they think pills are safe. They come from doctors, they come from the FDA. They're not the same as street drugs. And sadly, we have a wave of real predatory type stuff going on with these counterfeit pills. And so my son was a victim to fentanyl poisoning.
Okay. You mentioned that you're with another group that focuses a lot on the criminal part of the investigation of this. Were you able to backtrace to the person that actually was responsible for providing that drug?
We really did kind of have knowledge pretty much right away. We knew who he had been with, we knew where he had been. There were pills on his person. It was not a real big task to draw those, get those lines made. But, the burden that law enforcement has in comparison to what we know, it's not necessarily what you know, it's what can be proven.
Right.
And unfortunately, in the community that I live in right now, Lake County, Illinois, is been within the top 10 leaders in drug-related deaths for almost a decade. And within Lake County, the city I reside in has been within the top 10 for about a decade as well. And we've had a drug-induced homicide statute since 1989. But in the entire time that that statute has been in place, I live in a city which has never convicted anyone for a drug-induced homicide, even though we have a great deal amount of people who are suffering to that fate. I've absolutely experienced a heartbreaking level of disinterest and lack of follow through from local law enforcement, and it has felt that a bulk of the research and even investigating has fallen upon my shoulders. I felt that I've had to really push at every turn to get them to do things. They left evidence in our home. I don't think they ever really intended to investigate this stuff. And I don't think that that's something that they were anticipating, that a parent would become real insistent. And I've gone to really extreme degrees to get involvement from my local law enforcement, as far as going to my state's attorney, speaking with people from Homeland Security, speaking with people with the DEA, even the FBI. And sadly, we just see this trend for some reason, even though, especially in a case like my son's, where while he did engage in risky behavior by obtaining a pill that wasn't prescribed for him, um, I don't see it as any riskier than behaviors that we engage in every single day. And yet, the bulk of the culpability has been placed upon his shoulder. It seems that there's more compassion for the drug dealers, thoughts that they are in crisis themselves and they need to come up with creative ways to make money. Some of them are addicts themselves, and there's just an overall lack of interest and willingness and over here in our end. So we've always known who it was, and we were able to determine that through Facebook Messenger exchanges. This young person also, his name was brought up in connection to two other young people who died to fentanyl related deaths within our community within the last 3 years.
Wow. So he was one of three that this dealer, you can trace back and directly say that person was responsible for three deaths.
I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say I can personally trace him back to the other two, but I've spoken with the families of the other two young people, and he just was the last person who was with them. And he has been identified throughout, this peer group as somebody who has been a middleman, has been within the chain of delivery of fentanyl that has caused the deaths of other young people. And so it's not, I feel like it's almost like if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck type situation.
Right. But law enforcement, of course, has to go the extra step of proving beyond a shadow of a doubt. And that's apparently where there's a disconnect. Is that right?
It certainly does appear that way.
Well, and you know, that's what our Constitution says, and that's a good thing because nobody should be wrongly convicted of something that they did not do.
Absolutely.
So I get both sides of it, but man, it is very tough to sit here and think about the fact that your son was like one of three that most likely this person contributed to their death, and nothing has been done.
Well, and the big part about it is that, I absolutely agree with you that I would never want for somebody to be convicted of a crime. I think there's a misconception that when a parent wants for there to be a conviction of a drug dealer, that this is coming from a place of vengeance, that we just want our pound of flesh. We need somebody to blame this on, right? However, our children are already dead, right? So, I mean, when you look at people like April Babcock, who's, her son's been gone for several years, nothing she's doing right now is going to bring him back.
Mm.
But what she hopes is that his life was not lost in vain, that somehow from that ruin, something good can come and that it will create safer conditions for our living children and our living grandchildren. And so I think that often when we're going to law enforcement and saying we want these deaths investigated, they really do believe in their hearts that this is just something we need. We need justice for our children. But the truth of the matter is that we don't want somebody behind bars just for the sake of having them there. We want for them to be able to use these deaths as resources to collect valuable information that, while may or may not lead to a conviction in our child's death, could give them some ideas of what's going on within the community and put people on the radar and potentially create safer conditions for the next young person who's going to come into contact with them. And
Right.
so, you know, getting drugs off the street, I think, has been quickly tied to what we call the war on drugs, which is such a divisive and controversial era in our American history, where it's believed that people of color were the target of the war on drugs, and that this was just means to incarcerate people of color. Well, in reality, a great deal of the people who are dealing these drugs are not people of color, and many of the victims are not people of color, and it does not discriminate. And so it's sad to me that there has been sort of an overall mindset that these deaths shouldn't be investigated and that there shouldn't be consequences for a drug dealer, and that full culpability should be placed on the person who voluntarily put something in their body that had potential to cause harm. And so we have a harm reduction movement underway where they're really pushing Narcan, they're really pushing testing strips, and they're really kind of focusing on the demand of illicit drugs. But what they're failing to acknowledge is that while demand is certainly there, and it always will be, if these young people like my son go into programming and they stay there for 2 years and they do all the work, but then they discharge into a community that's overflowing with drugs and predatory drug dealers who rely on their relapse in order to make a monetary gain, the odds are stacked infinitely in their, against them. And so it just doesn't seem that there is much empathy, and especially feels that way coming from our liberal brothers and sisters. I was a registered Democrat my entire life, voted Democrat every year since I've been old enough to vote. I participated in campaigning for Joe Biden as well as Biden as a vice president alongside of Obama. I mean, I did campaigning. I've donated on a fixed income. I was extremely vested in this party and this administration. And when I lost my son and I went down this rabbit hole and I started seeing the truth and the statistics that are associated with these deaths and what has happened, and its direct link to some of these this administration's new policy rollouts, it's heartbreaking because it proves to me in an undeniable capacity that There have been decisions made by this administration that have absolutely been to the detriment of American people, and that alongside of those decisions, there is a categorical their ignorance of it. They won't talk about it. They won't address it, and there is no interest of them. But they will talk about gun violence, deaths, and that's a big push for them. But when I hear that gun violence is the leading cause of children, and then I go and I look at these statistics, and the statistics that that statement, that broad statement, is based on, it excludes babies, infancy through 1, because the leading cause of death of infants is actually birth defects and premature birth. And it includes people 18 to 19, which is not childhood. Once you turn 18, you're no longer a child. It
True.
also includes the unfortunate deaths of people who've taken their own lives. And so when you take all those things and you factor them in and compare them to the statistics that are in place regarding the fentanyl crisis in our country, you'll learn that in 2021, there was more infant and children deaths related to fentanyl than there were to gun violence. And in fact, by a long shot, in 2021, there was a significant increase in pediatric deaths related to drug poisonings, and almost exclusively across the board caused by fentanyl. That statistic included 40 infants and 93 children ages 1 through 4. There was a quadrupling of deaths in children ages 5 through 14. And so when we're gonna, if they're not gonna view my son as a victim, and if they're not gonna acknowledge that my son was a victim, how do they explain that 5-year-olds don't know anything about going out and procuring an illicit drug? These are accidental. And so it feels like there has been a very intentional manipulation of numbers used to push agendas and also diminish agendas. And the agenda that has been diminished is the one that directly impacted me. And as a result, I have a very, very strong broken heart as it pertains to our government and its lack of response to this issue.
I am so thankful that you brought that up, because one of the things that I said, we recorded a short video as an announcement to this mini series that we're running this week. And one of the things that I stressed in that introductory video was fentanyl is it is a nonpartisan, equal opportunity killer. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how you voted. When you call 911, they're not going to ask you how you voted. They don't care. This is a red, white, and blue issue. It is not red. It is not blue. It's not liberal. It's not conservative. It is an equal opportunity killer of our children. Now, I'd like to just speak to one thing you said, and I just want to say to the listeners, Dawn and I did not discuss any of this before we started recording. All of this is totally spontaneous, and I'm very appreciative for that, because she brought up some things that we really want to address with our listeners. It is my belief, and I think I hear you saying the same thing, that our government is turning a blind eye to this. Would you agree?
Oh, I mean, I not only agree, but I'm convinced.
Do you think that they have an agenda of wanting to turn a blind eye? Do you think they have an agenda of wanting to kill our children?
It's really hard to get my finger on the pulse there, because I mean, again, I'm 1 year out from losing my son, and this has been a very transformative year for me. And a lot of my most fundamental beliefs and mindsets have been really put in question. And I don't know that I'm ready to believe that they have a vested interest in our children dying. But what I do know is that the industry of addiction is a billion, if not trillion-dollar industry. And they don't get to make that money if our kids are getting well. And when Big Pharma was sued to the tune of billions and trillions of dollars that got paid out to all states within the country in its role for the opioid crisis that came with the introduction of OxyContin, I find it really unique and ironic that now we have this wonder drug, this Narcan, which again is saving lives. It's amazing. Everyone should know how to use it and access it. This is definitely not meant to downplay the importance of it. But it's interesting to me that that has been almost across the board one of the biggest areas that these funds have gone to. So Big Pharma pays out all this money because of their role in this crisis, and now Big Pharma is getting a bulk of that money back in the form of purchasing of Narcan, which is being paid for out of these opioid settlement funds. And the cities and states that have gotten the lion's share of it, instead of looking for creative solutions to really make an impact on this epidemic, it's all going into getting Narcan into schools, getting Narcan trainings available. Again, wonderful. But I spoke with the battalion chief for the police department in my city about Narcan and asked her pointedly what her feelings were on it and what impact has it had for first responders. And she said it was great. It's amazing. It's a wonderful resource, but has had absolutely no impact on how many calls they respond to in a week. And they are often reviving the same person 5, 6, 7 times in a month. And every time they do that, that is more money that goes back to Big Pharma. So it seems that it is a real conflict of interest there, and
Mhm.
so I think it has a lot more to do with them wanting our children to be addicted. I don't think drug dealers or anybody necessarily wants these deaths to happen, but because the cost to make it one lethal dose of illicit fentanyl costs less than a penny to make. Now compare that to the street value of a Xanax or a Percocet that can sell for sometimes $15, $20 a pill. We're talking about 1,000% markup. I mean, so there's currently have every reason to continue and nobody discouraging them not to. They aren't seeing their colleagues, for lack of a better word, being put in prison for murder. And until they do, they will not see this as anything less consequential than passing a joint to somebody, even though this is a weapon of mass destruction and it's killing thousands and thousands of people every single month. So and that's a very long-winded answer. I don't know that I believe they want our kids to die. I do think that there is stuff going outside of our country, whereas China is involved with their involvement in getting the precursor drugs over to Mexico, where a lot of these pills are being manufactured and then being sent through with mules. And I think China has a vested interest in seeing something bad happen to us.
I do.
I just think that our country is complicit at this time in those efforts.
That is a great way to put that, and I appreciate it. I was reluctant to say that, but you're coming at this from a perspective of, number one, you lost your child to this poison. Number two, you're coming at it from a perspective of a medical professional. And number three, you're coming at it from someone who has done a lot of legwork with the law enforcement.
I don't
So,
think anything will send you down a rabbit hole quicker than losing a child to something that you learn is an epidemic. When you realize that your son or your loved one's death is not unique and that people are experiencing this in record numbers, you'll go down that rabbit hole. And if you're a person like me, I am a very analytical person. I want to understand things in black and white. I don't want things that are based off feeling or opinion. I really want to do everything in my power. If I'm going to be effective in bringing forth any change, it's only going to happen by being informed. And I
well,
have really put the time in to get informed.
so I hear calls to action that sound similar to what I've heard from April and others that I've already talked with. And one is obviously having fentanyl identified as a weapon of mass destruction. And I think that's a huge first step. Another thing that has been mentioned is having the cartels deemed as terrorists. That would also help in cutting down on what's coming through the country. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I can only speak for myself, but I almost feel like, and again, this is just my opinion on it, but it almost is sort of laughable to me that there would be a need to have the drug cartels, which not only are terrorizing our country, but terrorizing Mexico as well, that they would need to be classified as terrorists when they live, breathe, and act as terrorists with no deviation. You know what I mean? They are categorically terrorists. And the same applies to fentanyl. When you look at the definition of what a weapon of mass destruction is, it checks every box. And yet, the fact that there are mothers who are being tasked with the responsibility of trying to figure out a way to convince our government to prioritize this in lieu of mourning their loved one, their child, they're being put in this position to fight for these things, it's so insulting. It's insulting that those classifications even need to be made.
It is. But it goes back to the one word you said that I feel sums up everything. And I so appreciate you saying it, complicit, because our government is complicit by their lack of inaction. You may have seen the documentary that came out recently, Letter to the American Church by Eric Metaxas. And he said in the book, as well as the documentary, doing nothing in the face of evil is still evil. And I think that that's a very applicable statement to what we see going on in the fentanyl crisis in our nation.
I couldn't agree more. You know, an interesting thing that I kind of came across is, so April Babcock, her group, the Lost Voices of Fentanyl, for the last 3 years, they have had a peaceful rally outside of the White House where they meet with bereft families, carrying photographs of their lost loved ones, and a variety of speakers stand up and share their stories. And they've been doing that for about 3 or 4 years. And that group has grown and grown and grown to the extent that last year I know that there were thousands of people in attendance. And I thought, certainly I was unable to attend. I was only a few months out of my son's death, and I actually officiated my niece's wedding that weekend. And so I wasn't in attendance, but I was really curious to find out, you know, what like, would there be a representative from the Biden administration who would address these people? Would there be some coverage in media? I mean, certainly anytime there is some kind of a, demonstration outside the White House, it seems that we are apprised of it and we know kind of what happened. And so when that didn't, when that day came, I went on to social media and I looked at Twitter and I looked at Instagram and a variety of others to see what the response was. Were they going to address this? And not only did President Biden not address or acknowledge these families that stood outside of the White House in a hurricane, basically, in pouring rain, but on that day, he felt that the most important issue to address was to talk about hidden ticket fees and what he's now coined as junk fees that have been associated or attached to the sales of concert and sporting event tickets. And I just about lost my mind. I thought, you are so tone deaf. What an insulting thing that is the factor. So what I did was I wanted to find on social media what President Biden or his administration affiliates have been saying about fentanyl. So I go into Twitter or X to do a search, and I put in the search bar fentanyl. And I was very dismayed to see that on his X account, he has posted 12 times talking about fentanyl. 2 of those were basically repeats of the other, addressing when fentanyl is mixed with xylazine in particular. Xylazine is a horse tranquilizer, and it's being combined with fentanyl, and they're calling it the zombie drug. And so he was talking specifically about xylazine and fentanyl, which xylazine is a threat, but it is also not showing up in the same amounts as fentanyl is. One of his posts was addressing marijuana, and it starts off talking about how marijuana and fentanyl are in the same class of drugs. And so in my mind, I thought, certainly what he's going to say is that fentanyl needs to be removed from this list and it needs to be placed in its own category where penalties associated with it would far outweigh those of anybody in possession of marijuana. But no, what he was saying is that marijuana does not belong in this category with these hard drugs. Marijuana needs to be taken away, and we need to continue to work on legislation that decreases the penalties and the stigma associated with marijuana, completely ignoring the threat of fentanyl. And so that left like maybe 3 or 4 posts where he just used the word fentanyl as it pertained to something else he was talking about. Zero, zilch, none, nothing. So then when I go to look for this post that he made on September 23rd about ticket sales and junk fees, and I do a search bar, I had to weed through over 50 posts that he made talking about the threat of overpriced tickets for Americans who want to go to concerts and football games. And it
Well,
makes me physically sick.
well, I think you summed it up well. just a complete disconnect with what the American people are experiencing. They don't get it.
And it's hard to understand considering that we know that President Biden has a loved one who has suffered with addiction.
Mhm.
And I feel like that is something, the amount of, they've classified him as the empathizer in chief. And believe me, that is how he got my vote. I definitely suffered from Trump derangement syndrome. I was completely amongst all of the virtue signalers throughout the pandemic. I drank that Kool-Aid so fast and hard. But the truth of the matter is that it is not empathetic. It is not empathetic to ignore an
No.
entire community of brokenhearted mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, and loved ones who have lost their loved one in a preventable death. And that is another thing that infuriates me. Is so when you look at statistics across the board that everyone wants to throw out all the time, we keep hearing about the threat of gun violence. And as I shared with you earlier, gun violence does incorporate suicide deaths, which I think belongs in its very own category. That addresses the mental health issues that our country is suffering, and they don't deserve to be lumped in with every other set of circumstances. But as it pertains to drug poisonings, which are going to be classified as overdoses, which we can talk about that another time. But when you want to find statistics about that, you'll learn that in 2023, the three leading cause of deaths in Americans of all ages was first heart disease, second cancer, three what they consider to be preventable death. So when you look at the preventable death category and you go and you find out what preventable deaths, they say that in 2023, the leading cause of preventable death was poisoning. So, okay, now you're thinking, what are poisonings? Then you find out that poisoning deaths actually include what are classified as overdose deaths. And so 3 tiers in is where you will find the overdose deaths. And when you look at the poisoning statistic, more than 80% of the poisoning statistic is compiled of drug overdoses. And
We had a slight blink in our technology. We're back. So Dawn, if you can please pick up where we left off. You were doing a great job and we had a little blip on the radar screen.
sure, thank you. So as I was explaining that the frustration and dismay that I have experienced over the course of this, going down this rabbit hole, learning that, in 2023, when we're being told repetitively, we can still go on the CDC website and see how many people have been impacted by the COVID-19 virus. And we're hearing about the numbers of deaths being caused by, gun violence and the call to change gun legislation. And then when you actually go down and really explore statistical input and or data, you'll find that in 2023, the third leading cause of death in Americans of all ages was actually preventable death. And when you go into preventable death statistics, you'll learn that the number one cause of preventable death was poisoning. And when you go into poisoning statistics, you'll learn that the number one cause of poisoning preventable deaths was actually drug overdose deaths, as are classified. But again, those numbers are buried under a heading that we're not seeing at first glance. And yet, the numbers that are being used to really push for legislation as it pertains to gun statistics is being bolstered by subtracting a year of childhood and then adding a year of adulthood and including a statistic of people who are suffering with mental health issues and sadly have ended their lives. And so I've been asking myself repeatedly, like, what could be the explanation for this? What vested interest could they possibly have for keeping this data so buried and yet bolstering and exploiting the other statistics for agenda? And it's just been it's just a devastating realization when you come to learn that the people and the things and the ideology and your most fundamental beliefs up to this point are aligned with something that has never been in our best interest.
That's true. I really appreciate you saying that. because you come at it from a perspective like few people do. And you're speaking from the heart and you're speaking truth. And I appreciate your bravery in sharing that.
Thank you.
So, are there any calls to action that you would like to just highlight? We kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, but I would like to close with some definitive calls to action that you see from your perspective.
Well, certainly, I have been working locally with my state's attorney and local law enforcement to really push for criminal action to be taken on drug dealers who deliver a substance that results in death. In most states, there is some form of legislation in place, but there are states throughout the country that do not have any existing legislation that indicates that this is a crime and that it can be penalized as one. And so additionally, we really are pushing hard for people to deviate away from the term overdose. Overdose implies culpability on the person who died. It gives culpability to the victim. And the bottom line is as far as illicit drugs are concerned, there is no recommended or safe dose. So if you can't tell me how much of something I could take safely, how can you then in turn tell me that I took too much of it and that I've overdosed on it? You know, on the CDC website, there is in fact formulas in place for people knowing how much alcohol can be consumed over a period of time based on your weight, based on how much food you've consumed. And yet when somebody dies from overconsumption of alcohol, it's classified as alcohol poisoning.
Yes, it
The bottom
is.
that
Mhm.
the term overdose is deeply stigmatizing, and it is probably a big reason why these cases tend to not get any traffic, because in its origin, overdose implies that the person participated in their own demise, and it removes culpability. Poisoning is what it is. And then even more compounded in the cases where these young people are getting drugs that were uh, deceptively presented as a prescription pill that is safe to take and that there is a safe dose for, but being pressed with sometimes multiple lethal doses of illicit fentanyl, which is 100 times stronger than street heroin. My son took a Xanax and had taken Xanax over the course of his treatment numerous times and knew how to consume it safely.
Mhm.
But when he died, he had 26 nanograms per milliliter of illicit fentanyl in his bloodstream. And yet the coroners have classified his death as a combined toxicity, even though the other substances that were in his bloodstream are prescribed in conjunction with each other and were in below therapeutic levels. And yet the amount of illicit fentanyl was enough to kill more than 5 full-grown men. So
Wow.
we are definitely trying to push people in a direction where they step away from some of this really problematic terminology, as well as really stay alert to the fact that we are being deceived currently. There is a lot of deception underway because fentanyl is so closely linked to the issue at the border, and because of the divisiveness of that topic, we really have our work cut out for us, because nobody in the who's affiliated with the Democratic Party wants to touch that. We just heard that the Republicans turned down this great border bill. But when you look at this border bill, you realize it wasn't a border bill, and there was no part of it that was outlined to really address this issue. In fact, it compounds it and creates more deficits for the next administration as they respond to this issue. So really just staying alert, doing your homework, dig a little deeper, challenge yourself to use better terminology, and obviously be prayerful, because there, as we've been on this conversation, they say every 11 minutes somebody is losing their life to a drug poisoning. And as much as prayer is important, it's going to take action behind those prayers.
It does. You have said some very impactful things, and I thank you for that. And what means the most to me is that you're saying things that I would have said, but you come from a different perspective. And it's probably more meaningful because of that. And especially the fact that you had the courage to call it out for what it is. And the fact that the Democrat Party has turned a blind eye to this. I will tell you that as we were attempting to promote this as a nonpartisan event here in our community, we have this event coming up April the 14th. And there are some businesses that said, although we agree with what you're doing and what you're saying, we're reluctant to post this because they didn't want pushback from Democrat people in our community. And it's like, I understand that, I get that, but at the same time, people have got to come to terms with the fact that this is not a partisan issue. They have to understand that, just as I've already stated, fentanyl is a bipartisan, nonpartisan, equal opportunity killer, that it affects us all. And we're just deceiving ourselves. As you said, I'm repeating what you said, we're deceiving ourselves if we call it anything different. So anyway, this
Now,
is
before I let you go, I wanted to add in there is that, something that really needs to be acknowledged is also that when we're talking about how the border crisis pertains to the fentanyl crisis, we are not saying that immigrants are the reason why all these drugs are in our country and that they are, waging war on us directly. But what we do know is that because of the influx of migrants at the border, there are Americans who are exploiting the overwhelmed border situation to bring drugs through the border because they know that with papers, their passage is going to be secondary to somebody who requires extra steps and layers before they can move through. And so it is because of the overwhelmed border that we are dealing with so much drugs coming through the border. Obviously, we recognize that a lot of the precursor chemicals are being sent to Mexico through China, and that a lot of the actual manufacturing is happening there, and that is an issue. And we do know that these people do have vested interests in harming us, but we are not pointing the finger at people who are trying to come into our country to seek asylum. That is not what we're saying. But we do know that it all does go hand in hand. And we can't step away from what has become the leading cause of death in Americans ages 17 through 46. We can't ignore that because it's too closely connected to something that nobody really wants to deal with or talk
right.
about.
Well said, my friend. So this has been very insightful. I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to connecting with you again very soon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity.
My pleasure.